In true TED style, I want to tell you a story. I want to tell you a story about a big idea. A big idea that we turned into action. I like big ideas. There's a lot of them floating around these days. You know, climate change, economic crises, people talking about healthcare issues. Sometimes I'm the activist. Sometimes I'm the Sioux. Sometimes I'm in the streets protesting. And sometimes I'm in the halls of power. Now, one of the things that boggles my mind is why does it take so long for the ideas that are in the streets to get into the halls of power? And why does it take so long once they're in the halls of power to get to people making big decisions about them? But before I go there, I want to get back to that idea and that story. And I want to tell you about how we turned that idea into action, how we theorized about it, then we experimented with it. We faced a lot of challenges. We overcame those challenges, and how we're still doing it today. This story starts in a pub, like most good stories. A couple of guys hanging around, just throwing around some ideas. I wasn't actually there, so I don't even know. But apparently they were talking about, you know, this platform. Maybe we could build something that would connect people in the streets to the halls of power. Give people direct access to the people in power. Maybe we could do something. So I got home that night at 2 o'clock in the morning, having no idea about this conversation, and I get a text message, 2 o'clock in the morning, and it says this: do you know anything about eGov? Now at 2 o'clock in the morning on a weekend, I'm hoping it's somebody flirting with me who wants to start a conversation. But eGov is the last thing I'd expect to hear about. And I knew a little bit about it. In fact, it's a pretty boring topic. It's something about governments connecting with citizens, using digital technology. Who cares? And the more I thought about it, I don't really care that much, but I did know a bit about it. So I said, yeah, I know a bit. And he said, all right, meet me for drinks next Friday. And so I rock up, and there's a couple guys there, and we're having a couple drinks. We're throwing around big ideas, that platform, connection, people. People need to be involved. Look at what they're doing in the US or other countries. We got to do the same here. We got to make it better. And so fast forward a couple of weeks, I'm sitting in a leadership course, and we got a room full of 25 young leaders, and a member of parliament comes in, and he says to us, how many of you are members of a political party? And 0 hands go up. And then he says, how many of you have an issue that you want to see a politician address? And every single hand goes up. And I realized then that that idea was very powerful, and there was a clear gap between the places where we talk about the issues that matter to us most and the places where big decisions are made. But I had to check it out. So I went to the place where we all go, the internet. And when I got to the internet, I found this cool diagram that showed us where people hang out on the internet. Now, if you look at this diagram, the big blue circles in the middle represent social media sites. As you can tell, they're much larger than the rest. And the green circles on the fringe represent government websites. And it's clear that nobody wants to go to a boring government website, and everyone's clearly talking about a lot of stuff on social media. In fact, there's not much that's interesting about this diagram other than making me certain that my idea was clear. In fact, the only interesting thing is this big green circle right here. In fact, this government website is the Bureau of Meteorology. And I'm not from around here, but I hear Australians really love talking about the weather. Maybe it's because there's not much else to talk about there. So I thought, let's take this a bit further. Surely we're not the first people to have thought this was a good idea. In fact, someone else might have thought about this at some point in history. So I thought, let's map this idea of taking ideas from the streets into the halls of power. And I looked at a bit of history, and I saw that, lo and behold, a couple of years ago, some guys, probably hanging out in a pub, were talking about this crazy idea. What if we took the power from a king who'd inherited it, the power to make decisions by right of birth, and we handed it to a couple of people that we elected and got them to make decisions on our behalf? In fact, he thought, let's decentralize the power for one person with that God-given right, to a bunch of people that we thought were more qualified. And he knew that if we got all the masses to make the big decisions for the society, it would be hard. But if we elected a few, it would be far more logistically possible. So we did. And as we decentralized that power, we realized we had to come up with some ways to inform the public about these big issues. So we figured, let's go with a printing press and give people things to read and write. In fact, they'd have to learn how to read and write and start thinking. And as they became enlightened, they started realizing that they might have rights. Rights as men, eventually women. And they thought, let's write those rights into some constitutions for our nations. And multiple nations around the world started to write these rights in. And eventually they even started fighting some wars about them. They said, maybe it's not democracy. Maybe it's actually communism. Maybe it's fascism. Maybe it's other forms of government. No matter what it was, when the dust settled after all those wars, we realized that people still wanted to be involved in the government that they were a part of. And so we fast forward to the second most remarkable invention on this timeline. It's something that radically transforms the way we think about politics, the internet. At some point in time, we realized that it wasn't just from point source to the many, but now every individual could research and think about the big issues and come up with their own opinions and actually build a movement behind them. Suddenly, every single one of us became a hall of power. And so in this moment, we realized that Aristotle's original idea, the few and the many, is no longer that relevant, because the many can now make decisions on the big issues. It was never a philosophical problem, it was a logistical problem, a technological problem. And now we have the technology to involve the masses in big decision making. So what does this mean for politics? We're here. So it means that things aren't actually going to change that quickly yet. There's a few challenges to overcome. First of all, we've got our leaders. They were elected for a reason, to represent certain interests, to protect certain interests, the vested ones. And they're not going to jump over that quickly or say, yep, let's just hand over the power to the people. And in fact, we put the media in place to dig out the muck between those leaders' toes, to find out what are these leaders that we elected, what are they talking about, what's good and what's bad, decipher it for us, explain to us what we need to know before we vote in the next election. And the more and more they got involved with the leaders, they started to become insiders. And suddenly we had these two parts of society together. The media meant to break stories to give them to the outside, but the more they realized their business model was dependent on the leaders, the more they got in bed with the leaders. And here we are, left on the side, just hanging out, thinking, that's a little bit interesting, but memes on Facebook are way more interesting. You know? And a few of us got interested and we thought, that's kind of cool, so maybe I'll write a blog post about it or tell my friends about it on Facebook and Twitter and other social media sites, but I'm not going to get involved. But now that we have the internet, what if we could use that to bring the citizens back into the game and make them key stakeholders in the big decisions that we make about our society? So back to our story. We thought, let's try it. So we built this thing called Our Say. And we said, and these were the rules of the game. First, let's wrangle some people in positions of power. Let's get politicians, maybe some corporate CEOs, to agree to answer questions. And once we'd locked them in, we invited media partners, major media partners around the country, to agree to report on issues as they came from the bottom up. As citizens' issues emerged, they would report on them. And then we thought, let's set the clock for 1 month, and we'll tell the public to get involved. And the rules of the game were this. First, sign up and ask a question. Think about an issue that matters to you and ask a question about it. Next, vote. Everybody gets 7 votes, which is way more than the government gives you. And so use your votes wisely. Once you've finished your votes, share. Tell your friends on all the social media channels out there, invite them to come and vote for your questions. And whichever questions make it to the top, those questions get answered by our leaders. And then you can share the responses and discuss whether or not they resolve something that you were looking for, or what's the next layer of this conversation. So we decided to launch this idea in 2010 during the Australian federal election. And so here I am standing in a bookstore in Melbourne thinking, let's do it here in this city that we're all quite familiar with, and let's lock in those political candidates. And I'm presenting this idea to a bookstore, and an expat in the back of the room, who hasn't been in a bookstore since he was about 4 years old, is hearing the rules of the game. And he suddenly thinks to himself, I want to win this thing. So he goes home that night, he posts a question, he takes his laptop to his gym where he works at the next day, and as people walk into the gym, he tells them the story. Please vote for my question, this is how it works, I want to get to the top. And overnight his question skyrockets to the top of the list. And the political candidates, when the forum came to a close, contacted me and they said, do we really need to answer a question about should there be a legalized age on caffeinated drinks? This is not a paramount issue during this election. And I said, these are the rules of the game. You have to answer the question. And so they had sent off their political advisors to research what their positions would be on this seemingly futile issue. And they responded. Now, whether or not this was the most important issue in the seat of Melbourne, or whether or not it was just the most important for Sam, didn't really matter. What did matter was that someone who was completely politically disengaged was heavily involved in the political process and driving the top issue for the seat of Melbourne. And the other thing was that we had politicians actually forming their entire policy positions about one individual's issue, which many, many people had voted for. Suddenly they had reshaped, no longer projecting the ideas they wanted people to think about, but actually responding to what the public wanted to know about. So we tried this a few more times at a state level, and eventually we partnered with a couple of major media, and after about 2 years, we were ready for something big. We thought, what if we get the head of this nation to respond to the top questions that the public have? And so after contacting Fairfax Media and working with the Prime Minister's office, 6 months in, it's the night before we're going to launch the site. And the Prime Minister's office contacts me and they say, we want to pick the questions, we don't want to work with Arsene. And after 6 months of working on this, my heart drops. And I think, they don't get it. They missed the point. And so I slammed 4 coffees, I chowed on some Indian curry, my favorite, and I got on the phone with as many media advisors as I could. And finally I convinced them to come back on board. And the site went live and everything went to plan. And while we were going through the notions, I reflected on a couple of things. I reflected on our leaders and where the people inside this political office were at. Made me think about the West Wing, actually. You know, here's all these chief political minders. We've got Josh Lyman and a couple of his mates, and they're trying to put out spot fires as they emerge, trying to manage what's going on. It's really complex, it's really intense. And now that we've got the internet, there's even more spot fires, and the spot fires are getting bigger. And so I thought to myself, is it really just one crack team that can solve all of these spot fires and put them all out? Or can they involve the masses in some of the decisions that they make? I also thought about the media. While we were working with Fairfax, journalists were contacting me saying, hey, can I get the phone number for that guy in Queensland and the farmer, you know? Or hey, can I get the phone number? Or who's this person? Where did this question come from? And suddenly, they were breaking stories not from the leadership, but they had to break stories from the citizens and find out where these citizens were coming from. And so they're straddling with one foot in the Prime Minister's office and the other foot in the streets, trying to find out what's going on. And they weren't sure which way to go. And finally, it was about the citizens, who were now so powerful that they could directly engage with the head of the nation. And at first they were cynical, and they said this will never happen. And when it happened, they said, well, anyways, it's going to be the same old, same old. And maybe it was the same old, same old. Maybe nothing really happened. But what did happen was something profound. It was the fact that people suddenly had new expectations. If you can have direct access to the head of the nation, and you have ideas that are as powerful, or if not greater than what the head of the nation has, then perhaps we don't need representation. Perhaps we can govern ourselves. And the other thing is, if we do have representatives, what can we reasonably expect from them in this new world context? Now for leaders, I think transitioning towards this new world is a big challenge. In fact, we can't come back with the same old tiny ideas that we had when we were just thinking about ourselves or our local communities. We actually need leaders to think about big vision, big ideas, things that are bigger than we've ever seen before, not just the nation, but globally, where we sit in that. And as leaders set new vision, it's about setting up ways to share control of the mission on delivering on that vision, share the dilemmas, share the things that we see on the horizon. It's also about setting evaluation mechanisms so that citizens can actually evaluate whether or not we're progressing in the right direction. And if your vision isn't big enough, maybe you shouldn't be in that role. It's also about the media taking a different approach and no longer trying to break stories from the top down, but actually becoming curators of voice and identifying all of those emerging voices on different social media platforms and bringing them into the conversation to enhance our public discourse. And finally, it's about the citizens, stepping up and taking ownership and responsibility for the issues that they care about. And if it's not there, get it in there. So what's next? Well, we thought, let's go big and let's go small. Big is the world's largest democracy, India. The average age of a citizen in India is 25. while the average age of a government minister in India is 65. What an immense gap. Now in India, people are more likely to use their mobile phone than they are likely to be connected to the internet, which presents a whole new world of challenges of how do you use new and modern technology to build the telephone Facebook so that people can connect from the telephone to the internet up to their leaders. Small is Hepburnshire Council, 90 minutes down the road. A tiny city that was interested in bringing their citizens' ideas into their local council plan. And so we went there and spoke to people about local issues, everyday things that they see when they leave their homes. And it was the first time that a council involved 10% of its population in the development of its council plan. So from a local hamlet of 300 to a nation of over 1 billion, we want to make sure that this model works, and we want to make sure that people get involved. So now you. Like I said, you're all leading voices now in the places that you hang out. Therefore, you're leaders. So I ask you to ask responsibly and join the conversation. Thank you.